This is Untitled, the Atari 8-bit podcast.
Just as soon as one caller would get off, another one would come on, and we had so much going on. Before the internet, we had worldwide networking. We had message bases, emails, and file mail going around the world to Christchurch, New Zealand, and everything. It was just great.
This is Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. I'm Kevin Savitz. Tom Hunt ran an Atari BBS called Closer to Home for 28 years. He also created a variety of utilities for the Atari 8-bit computers, including M.T.O.S, the Multitasking operating system, and the Armorizer, a file corruption detector. He created several languages, including Atari implementations of the Brainfork and Mouse programming languages, and forks of Atari Basic and Turbo Basic with various feature additions. He also built a system for porting Inform 5 and Z-Code text adventures to the Atari platform. This interview took place on August 5th, 2017.
I was born and bred in the state of Ohio, raised on a farm, and it was sometime in the 1960s I actually built my first computer from a kit. And it had 3 bits of output, and the computer was called Digicomp, and that instantly intrigued me. And it wasn't very sturdy, and eventually after a couple of years it started breaking down. And of course I was only a child at the time. Let's see, I probably would have been around 10, 1966. Yeah, that's right. So that was my first real interest in computers. And then moving ahead, I can remember reading in the magazines like Creative Computing, then Byte magazine. Popular Science was probably the first magazine that advertised or had on the cover the Altair. And I bought and read through the article, and something just bit me. The bug bit me. And my wife and I, we had at least one young child at the time, and it was really hard making ends meet, but I still said, come on, can I have it? And she said, now, Tom, think about this. Look at these bills. I don't think so. Okay. So eventually I was able to afford a VIC-20, and that was the first of the modern computers or personal home computers or game computers, computer that I was ever able to own.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And how did you eventually become an Atari guy?
Oh, that's interesting. I worked second shift, and one of my buddies worked second shift with me.
What were you doing?
And computer output microfilm.
Computer output microfilm. I know what all those words mean, but not in that order. What is that? What's that job?
Microfilm was a really big business because you could take a whole room full of paper catalogs and shrink it down to just a few microfilm.
Sure.
And computer output microfilm would actually take the data tapes. We had a lot of 9 tracks, then we went to 3480s, then we went to 3490 tapes. And we had a very precise camera that looked down on what most people would call an O-scope, but it was a high-definition O-scope. And the beam would draw each frame and all the characters while the camera would be exposed to it, advance to the next frame, and then the next page would be drawn on the O-scope, and so on and so on and so on. Okay. But he was the guy he was the engineer that maintained the machine. And he had bought an Atari 800, and I was somewhat unfamiliar with it. I didn't know the capabilities. I had seen it advertised, and I knew it was out of my price league. We're talking, having trouble making the ends meet at home. Mm-hmm. But anyways, we had a great time at break time comparing the different things that our computers could do. And although I could make my little VIC-20 with, I think I had a 16 kilobyte RAM expansion pack,
Fancy.
Oh, I could do, yeah, I could do character graphics, animation graphics, and things like that. And he started talking about his 800 doing the GTIA highway, and all this was just from the basic programs that he typed in. And pretty soon, I came to realize that the 800 was a much better machine, and I just had to have one.
Yeah.
So eventually I found a way to save my pennies and get one.
Nice. All right, so once you got it, okay, so I've looked at, kind of made a list of the things you did with the Atari over the years, and you ran a BBS, and you did stuff with Inform and Text Adventures, and you wrote a bunch of programs. I really don't have a sense of the order things came in. So when you first got it, what did you dive into first? What was sparking your interest?
Well, just like most users, when you first get the machine, you pull up the manual and you type in the little demos. And I was really impressed. I loved it right away.
Yeah.
And as time went on, you have to have a data recorder, those cassette tapes. But eventually, I've always had a love of programming, even if it's just basic. And so I started off with basic. And some of the basic programs had embedded machine language strings, those funny graphic characters held in quotes, and I wanted to know what those opcodes and operands were doing. So naturally, I started swinging more and more into assembly language, but at the same time, concurrently, any other higher-level programming languages that was available on the Atari. But always the driving force was to understand the hardware, to understand the timing, to understand the output 10 functions of all the chips, and to be able to try to leverage just a little bit more, just simply because for most people, there were a lot more advanced programmers than me, but for most of us, it was almost like a black box. You knew this pin here was supposed to support a certain timing signal, and if you could tap into that, you could do something different with the screen. So, it was a big adventure.
You ran Closer to Home BBS, which was online for like 28 years or something ridiculous. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, quite ridiculous, I know. I was one of those diehards that just kept things going.
Wow. All right. So what year did it go up, and when about when did it come down?
Okay, I'm trying to think. It seems like it went up sometime around 86, running Amos software. And sometime in the 2000s, in the aughts, as the old-timers used to say, is when I finally decided, I have to move on. I'll never really get it out of my system, but I just can't actively try to, participate and keep things going anymore.
So coming up on 86, kind of a mid to late comer to the BBS world, really.
Yes. If you compare it, for instance, to the CPM BBSs, which were the first consumer-grade bulletin board services, they were earlier. That's for sure.
Right. Even in the Atari world, some of those were coming up around 82, 83. So, not that 86 is that much later, but you had a stick-to-itiveness. You switched to the internet and being online and telnetting and all that stuff.
Well, right. Eventually, my bulletin board, that is, my dial-up bulletin board, was only getting a couple of calls a day. And, after going through the thick of things where just as soon as one caller would get off, another one would come on, and, we had so much going on. Before the internet, we had worldwide networking. We had message bases, emails, and file mail going around the world to Christchurch, New Zealand, and everything. It was just great. And this was all on our nickel. And when I say our, I'm talking about, there was lots of participating sysops. And so it was a real exciting time. You really felt like you were contributing to something positive, much bigger than yourself. But then, like I said, the calls on the dial-up were dwindling down, and so by that time, I was fairly proficient in C++, and I used as my code base one of the Atari emulators. I can't remember which one right now, but it did not support an R to WinSock conversion. My goal was to run my bulletin board service in emulation on a desktop. And so I wanted to run BBS Express Professional specifically, which depends on some specific lines of the serial port that other less complicated BBS programs ignore. So in other words, in order to emulate the WinSock, or the R device, I should say, I had to develop a lot more code to support all the lines that BBS Express Professional required. So that was my goal, and I accomplished it. I ran it for a few more, I don't know, I can't remember, between 2-4 more years, maybe 5 years, as a, you could call in through Telnet.
Nice. Cool. So you sent me this text file that you wrote in 2000, just kind of documenting some of your Atari history at that point, and it was super interesting. But I don't want to. I have no intention of harping on the negative here, but you kind of goes on for a while about like sysop wars and drama between this group and that group, and it seemed like a major part of the scene for you was arguing with people, and I just kind of want to ask about that, because that's kind of I miss that in my experience, so I just kind of want to know about that.
Well, certainly. Actually, I didn't participate as an active participant in what I call the sysop wars. However, when you're networked with a bunch of other sysops, you could definitely say you've got your ear against the rail, and so you're exposed to it. Well, without going into too much detail, because in retrospect, there were strong personalities with a lot of pride in what they were doing, and I'm trying to be fair here, okay? And they might have felt threatened by other sysops with better systems, or should I say, some sysops wrote their own code, okay? And they might have felt that, well, I put all this work into something, and now this other one's coming along, and it's going to take over my little niche. But if you'd like to, for me to comment on anything specific, go ahead and ask.
No, I'm not really trying to dig up specific old issues. I just kind of wanted to know if that was, I don't know, what it just, you said it, strong personalities and people running their little realms, and people were into it. I mean, they loved what they were doing, I think, and they felt strongly about it, right?
Very strong feelings. Very strong feelings.
You were involved with the Mid-Ohio Atari Users Group meetings.
Yeah, that was...
Tell me about that.
That was just so great. Oh, yeah. A sysop from Ashland, Ohio, the name of his BBS was the Balloon Works, because there was a factory in town that made balloons. So he called his BBS the Balloon Works BBS. And it was so great to have a local BBS. Oh, man, it was so great, because I'm out, compared to metropolitan areas, I'm out here in the country in the middle of nowhere, you know, and if I wanted to call anywhere, it was long distance. And back then, long distance was expensive. Oh, man, I'd get on in the middle of the night long distance to call a BBS or Genie or CompuServe, and just 5 minutes, just 10 minutes. An hour later, I'm still on. My wife gets the bill. Tom, yeah, been down that road. What were we talking about?
The users group.
Oh, yeah. So he invited me to go to the Mid-Ohio Atari Users Group meeting, and it was my first users group meeting, and the camaraderie was just great. And different people would bring in their computers and their floppy drives. One guy actually made a portable unit, which was basically a large suitcase with a battery and what's it called, an inverter or an AC adapter in it, and even tiny color televisions were expensive back then. But he had one of those in this case, and that was great. And got to know a lot of Atarians, and it was just great. The camaraderie was great.
Nice. Awesome. All right, so I want to talk about some of the programs you wrote. So first of all, I have a buddy in Germany named Roland, and he is archiving software and trying to find things. And he says that you might have written 2 programs, I think, that were part of Action or libraries or something that seem to be missing. No one has them anymore. So I'm going to ask about that and how you created them and if you still have them. Something called the Graphics Utilities Library and something called Shape Editor. Did you write these for OSS or what?
Okay. Did you call the first one Graphics Utility Package?
I think I said Graphics Utilities Library, but I could be wrong.
I think he might be thinking about something other than what I wrote, just simply based upon the name. Now, having said that, I have written for both Action and for CC65 what I consider to be a great graphics utility package with super high-speed line drawing, box drawing, real fast fill because it doesn't use the chip to do the fill. It can do irregular shapes. And it's the library that I used for some of my desktop environments for the 8-bit, like M.T.O.S, in which you can, it's just a desktop, kind of sort of like Windows or any of the other desktops. But it required what I would consider a customized library of graphic routines that were optimized at least as much as it was possible for me to optimize them. And I thought I did a rather good job on it, and I created both an Action library and CC65 library. Shape editors, that's definitely not myself. I've written some things along those lines, but never released them, only when I was playing around with game programs. I seriously doubt I ever released a game program. I would bring a game program up to the point of where I would learn a new graphic technique or a new drawing algorithm, and I'd get things flowing back and forth across the screen and reacting responsively to the joystick, and I'd say, that's good, I like this, I don't have to take it any further. But then I would use what I had learned in like utilities.
And you did a lot of utilities. I want to talk about, before we get to the utilities, basics. Did you work on something called Fast Basic? Yeah. Tell me about that.
That was based upon Frost Basic, which, as you know, would run on an Atari 800. Obviously, it wasn't like Basic XL that I believe it stuffed a lot of itself up under the operating system in the underlying RAM. But I certainly did that, and trying to remember exactly what I did to it to make it run on an XL. I think I had to move buffers and memory around. I think it would clobber lower memory, especially on Sparta-DOS. I think that's what it was. So anyways, I made it so that you could easily run it with Sparta-DOS on an XL or XE and not use the RAM under the operating system, which would wipe out Sparta-DOS.
Sure. And you did a version of Turbo Basic. You took something called Closer to Home Turbo Basic version 3.2Q, which I think you took Turbo Basic and modified it for something.
Exactly. That's the one that was based on Frost Basic, the 800 version, the first version of Turbo Basic. And so that's what we're talking about, the one and the same program.
Oh, okay. Oh, right. So it had a couple different names then, it seems like.
Yeah, and there was something I whipped up called CTH Fast Basic, and it was based upon Atari Basic. Let's see, what was it? Version C, I believe. But of course, I replaced the BCD floating point math package with an internal fast math package, and I forget, there was a couple of other optimizations. I mean, it was not a major rewrite with new functions or whatever, but I liked running it because for what I was doing in BASIC, math-intensive calculations, it certainly did speed things up. And another version of BASIC I did, I believe it's called M-Basic. Micro Basic. Yeah, and the C source code had been out there for years, and the guy, up to the point of where I started working with it, every year had done some tweaks to it. In other words, it was an active code base, and he was so gracious to publish the source code and share it with the world. Now, I don't know if you've ever done any C language conversions from another machine to the CC65 that we have available for Atari, or to any other machine, but there's always ambiguities which are resolved differently on each compiler base. And so it's a challenge. You'd think, I'll just take this C code and compile it for the Atari and it'll run. No, it won't. First of all, obviously, if they make specific use of registers or specific memory locations, which are free and available on machine X, that obviously won't necessarily be free on machine Y. So it's not just a matter of properly allocating buffers and what have you. Just even the way they resolve pointers and the exact syntax of pointers and such, And so I think it was a fine package. It could support substrings, that is, subscripts on strings and numerical subscripts, and right string, left string, mid string, so it had a more advanced group of string manipulation routines, more like Microsoft. Plus, we had the C source code to it. I think I did that both in CC65 and in Action, and I know I published the Action source code. So it's out there somewhere. If not, nice. I got it around here somewhere.
Nice. Yeah, the other thing. Next thing I was going to ask you is what source code haven't you released, and do you still have it? And would you do that?
Oh, I would definitely consider it. I'd have to find it first. I mean, sure. I was kind of poking around this morning, and specifically, I was looking for my Inform source code. And most things I can find fairly fast. I just can't sit down and put my finger right on some of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But poking around in 10 or 20 minutes, I can usually find everything I'm looking for. But that's one thing, I couldn't put my finger on this morning. I'm sure it's still somewhere on these hard drives somewhere. Mm-hmm. But Inform was a really an interesting challenge. I really enjoyed working with the Inform compiler.
I want to talk about that. So I want to make sure I understand and listeners understand what you did. As I understand it, at the time you were taking output from the Inform 5 language and converting it to work with the Atari, which it couldn't natively do. And you took a bunch of things that Graham Nelson wrote and demos that Infocom put out and that sort of thing, and made them work on the Atari when originally they couldn't. Is that accurate?
I see you've been doing your homework. That's it exactly.
Excellent.
Yes. Yeah, it's just like you said. You have to use an older version of the Inform compiler and get the source code. Look the source code over because I believe that there might have been some machine-specific functions that it would support, although technically a plain vanilla generic Inform should run on any machine that has a Z-code interpreter. A Z-code interpreter is a virtual machine. Think of it almost like an emulator, like the Atari 800 Windows emulator, except we have an actual Atari 800 physical machine. It's a historical machine that it's emulating. The Z-code interpreter is emulating a virtual machine, a machine that was never actually made in hardware, to my knowledge. I mean, maybe somebody did it somewhere along the line, but the whole idea was that, like I said, the Z-code should run on any machine that has a Z-code interpreter. I thought it would be something that a lot of people would jump on simply because, number one, Infocom games and text games in general were quite popular in their day. And as the years went by, they started releasing less and less for the Atari 8-bit. I think the text adventure games from Infocom, to my recollection anyway, were the first to be cut back on for the Atari 8-bit. And eventually Activision started cutting back and so on and so forth. But they were popular back in the day.
Yeah.
And Zork would, they had versions for Commodore 64 and all these machines. So even though you and a small group of work associates might have different machines, you could all talk about your adventures in Zork. That was great. So I thought, I'll really release this stuff and just see if, people start saying, oh, this is great. I want to, see a lot more new text adventure games coming over from the published source code from the Inform games side. Mm-hmm. Even if the source code... Did you hear my chicken?
I did.
Okay. Obviously, I live out here in the country. Nice. Sorry about that.
I'm not editing that out. That's awesome.
Well, some of the newer source code takes advantage of features in the later compilers. And so you have to become familiar with what the old compiler supports and what it doesn't support, because you might grab some code for Inform 7, and it might use 1 or 2 or 3 advanced functions that the version 5 compiler doesn't support. Well, you can either just chop it out or reinterpret it into 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 separate functions that the version 5 compiler supports,
Mm-hmm. I was at, a couple of weeks ago, I was at Kansas Fest, which is a conference for Apple II computer enthusiasts, and there was a talk about almost exactly this. The guy was taking Inform 6 things and converting them to work with the Apple II, and so very similar, just on a slightly different platform.
Well, see, great minds think alike.
I guess so, yeah. And on the same thing, the reason I originally found you was that there's this other gentleman who's trying to do the same thing you did with Inform, and he was trying to do it today and was trying to find you to find out how you did it. So yeah.
Well, that's fine. I'd like to discuss it with him or email about it, and I'll see if there's anything I have here that he can use.
Excellent. Yeah, the text adventures just don't go out of style. It seems like. I mean, they're still making new ones, and there's IF Comp, and people are creating new things all the time. I kind of love it.
I like the Scott Adams games simply because you can usually get through them with an all-night session. In other words, there's more than one all-night session. I just couldn't stop until I got to the end. but the Infocom games they'd go on for days. There's one other thing I'd like to mention about text adventure games.
Sure.
I don't know if you are aware, but over in England, there was a adventure game construction set software that's called Quill, just like a writing quill.
Okay.
And it's based upon a much older term or older name, Quella, which I think means to write. Anyways, similar situation with that software and their source files for their games as compared to Inform, Z-Code, and all this other stuff we had just previously been talking about. For some reason, I want to say it's BBC software, but I might be wrong. They have a vast library of game source code. Okay, you might think, what can we do with it? Mm-hmm. There is a U.S.-based adventure game construction kit. Matter of fact, I might be wrong on this name. I think it's called Adventure Game Construction Set. And you can, in my terms, easily port these Quill game source codes to get them to run under this U.S. software. So, in other words, if somebody really likes adventure games, it shouldn't be very hard at all to release, who knows, how many dozens of new text adventure games for the 8-bit.
Oh, that would be an interesting project for sure. When you say easily, yeah. I'm assuming you're putting those in quotes, because what's easy for you may not be easy for me. But yeah.
Well, the methodology is the same. You have to study all the available functions for writing a game under Quill and do the same type of study and comparison, with the Adventure Game Construction Kit. Create a list of incompatible functions and decide, does this one just set the left screen margin to 0 or, something you can just chop out, or whether, there's no equivalent in the U.S. software. We're going to have to either figure out several functions that can take the place of or mimic the effect that it's trying to do, and so on and so forth. That's all.
Cool. Let's see. All right, so I have a list of other things I think you did, and I just kind of ask about them, and if you have anything to say, then we can talk about them. Otherwise, we can skip over it. I'd like to talk a little more about multitasking operating system.
Oh, that was fun.
Tell me about it.
That was fun to do. Oh, my gosh. Well, I had read from Byte magazine that the Apple II had something available. I believe it was called Software Carousel. And I read about it, and it said you can have multiple applications loaded up, and you just press these keys, and you can switch from this to this to this to this, in human terms, instantaneously. Mm-hmm. Obviously the machine had to do a lot of work behind the scene, and probably it took, 20th of a second to do a switch over. And I said, there's absolutely no reason why we can't have something like that for our Atari 8-bit. So I sat down and started plinking around. And it would run on Klaus Buchholz 256K upgrade or compatible. And I believe you would press like Shift Control 1 to go into the first snapshot, Shift Control 2 for the second, and so on and so forth. And all this was held in the extended memory. And jumping ahead, I eventually made one that actually did the same kind of thing, except it didn't use the extended memory. It saved the snapshots out to your hard drive. So that was great. You could just shut the whole machine down. Cool. Come back later and boot it up, hit Shift Control 3, and it would read that snapshot, and you'd be exactly where you left off at. Oh, and update the time and date. Now, that snapshot, I kind of transitioned, and I didn't tell you. I switched from multitasking operating system. Then I went back and I started talking about snapshot, okay? Mm-hmm. So two different pieces of software.
Okay.
So they're both related to each other, but they function in different ways. Multitasking operating system allowed you to have concurrent processes running all at the same time. Now, functionally, it's not necessarily a good idea, because whenever a background task was running in M.T.O.S, the foreground task would pause. You don't get something for nothing,
Sure.
And but I'll never forget the feeling I got when I could have, 3 or 4 multitasking programs all running at the same time, accomplishing calculations and disk I/O and stuff like that. I really enjoyed it. Just to think the machine could do something like that, although it was stop-start. If you were scrolling the screen on a big text file, stop, and start, stop and start. And in the background, every time the foreground would stop, the backgrounds would kick in and do their processing, saving to a virtual screen, which would be brought to the foreground when you would switch and bring it to the foreground.
Crazy. That's cool.
It is, yeah.
Let's see. And you did some Atari versions of programming languages. I think you did implementation of Mouse and an implementation of Brainfork.
Yes. Those were kind of fun. They're considered esoteric languages. And obviously it means languages which are not used in common everyday fashion, only because they're not, if you think of programming languages as a tree, and the main trunk might have been Fortran, or if you go down deep enough, it's machine language. But anyways, and there's all these nodes and branches. An esoteric language is a little twig way off to the side. So why would anyone be interested in that? Kevin, I think you and I have talked enough on this interview to know that I like a challenge, and I like to see my Atari 8-bit doing things that it's never done before. So that's just me. Now, Mouse is a stack-based language, which is very similar to Forth. Forth is a stack-based language, first in, first out. You develop, I forget the exact term that's used in Forth. I'll call them macro libraries of Forth commands. And so in order to perform a routine or function that returns parameters in Forth, you call this library of macros by one name, and with any parameters, input parameters if needed, and a pointer to the desired output variable. And Mouse supports the same thing. It has really terse nomenclature in its language. However, with its macro extension, you have a lot more flexibility to name your routines by any descriptive name you want, up to a point. I forget what the character limit is. So at the lowest level, Mouse is using probably most of the time single character commands for its functions.
Mm-hmm.
But it was rather fast. It's not the fastest language around, but getting that to run on the Atari 8-bit, I just loved that. And Brainfork is, in my opinion, really out there. It's kind of bizarre. But again, I created the source code and compiled it, and I took the test Brainfork source code for the Brainfork program and to use as a test, and compared the output, and the output was correct and proper, and that was another great feeling, another thing running on the good old Atari 8-bit that had never run before. Yeah, I really liked doing those projects.
Nice. Cool. Let's see. I'm going down the list. Some of the stuff I don't know what it is. Bunch of little file utilities and things. The Armorizer, a file corruption detector. Some unzip program. A recursive copy and a recursive delete utilities. Little things like that. You wrote something called... Do you have something to say about one of those, or?
Yeah, what was the first one again?
Armorizer, file corruption detector.
Yeah. Depending on a user's hardware, sometimes your hard drive might crash, and sometimes it will even become corrupt, and you don't know it because it didn't crash. But once corruption seemed to start on the hard drive, sometimes it would slowly exacerbate and affect other files. And you wouldn't know about it, especially as an 8-bit Atari with multiple 16 megabyte partitions. When you've got thousands and thousands and thousands of files, you don't run every file every day. And then one day you run something, and it does something weird, locks up your computer or whatever. And you start poking around. Oh, my gosh, another file overwrote sectors XYZ in the middle of this utility. What am I going to do? You start looking around with disk RX at the sector links, and you find out, oh, my gosh, at least 10% of the files on my hard drive are corrupt. Well, one thing that this Armorizer would do is every time, number one, you would have to armorize your executables in order to use the Armorizer. So, number one, you run the Armorizer. It asks you for what executable do you want me to armorize, and it would perform a CRC32 polynomial, and write a very small utility header in the front of the file, so that after the file had this utility and the CRC32 embedded in the front of the utility, every time you would run it after that, the loader would hit the header, which would start the init vector on the code in the header, which was the Armorizer. The Armorizer would take over. Number one, read right through the rest of the original utility that was appended to the end and perform a check. If there was one bit in the whole file that was off and if the CRC32 wouldn't match, it would give you certain options like stop, continue, or whatever. And it saved me a lot of grief on my hard drive.
You wrote a lot of software. Was it? How did you release it? Was it freeware? Was it shareware? Was it commercial? How did you release?
Most of the things I would just simply post on my Closer to Home BBS and the network of sysops. My attitude was, I find this useful for me. If anybody else would like to have it and maybe find it useful as well, here it is. I would simply occasionally put in a shareware blurb, which many kind people responded to. And I just want to express my appreciation because, just like a lot of people, sometimes money's tough, and especially when you're supporting a worldwide network on your own nickel in collaboration with the other sysops who are putting their own money into the long-distance calls and hardware and all that stuff. So I really appreciate the people that responded. But I never expected very much in return, if anything. But, I'd release it on my Closer to Home BBS, and from there other sysops would pick it up and put it in their download sections. So basically that's how that worked.
Nice. You did a CC65 cross-compiler, or were involved with that somehow?
Oh, boy, I'm trying to think. I did a lot of work with the CC65 cross-compiler. Some of it I kind of, sort of worked with, I believe it was Ken Siders, but he mainly came up with some great innovations for the assembler and the linker on his own. I do recall discussing with him some of the bugs I had found in CC65, and we discussed a little bit, but I'd say 99% of his utilities he did on his own. But I did a lot more work on CC65. What was the original program's name? Dunning? Oh, geez. I'm sorry. Memory fails me at this point in time. But he did such a wonderful job on the CC65 compiler, the linker, the assembler, and the librarian. And but there were a few bugs in there that only showed up under certain circumstances, meaning if you use it in a routine or a function the way 90% of the people would use it, it would return a proper value, but you throw something else into the equation and there would be a bug. So I did a lot of, I won't say a lot of, I did some cleanup of the code, and it took some time. You can imagine poking around here and there, but eventually I got the CC65 compiler to the point of where I could much more easily port C code that was written for other machines over to the Atari 8-bit, and of course, coming from the BBS scene. BBS Express Professional especially, Keith Ledbetter had written C65, and it was a very nice C implementation, but it wasn't a multipass compiler, therefore you could not make future references. All your references had to be declared ahead of time. Mm-hmm. At least this is what I think I remember. If somebody knows otherwise, they'll just have to forgive me. Dunning, or Dunnigan, whatever his name was, his CC65 compiler did multiple passes. You could make use of H files, include files, but it could resolve forward references just fine. A much more complex beast.
M.T.O.S graphical desktop environment.
Atari Os, yeah. That's something that I use some of what I consider my most advanced graphic routines in. And it was a fun project. And there was a lot of indirection. As I recall, you would create an icon or convert an IBM PC bitmap over to an Atari M.T.O.S icon, and embedded, I think, inside the icon or an associated file, it would make reference to the target file, whether it was an executable or, basic program or graphic program or a utility or something like that. And, it was fun to play around with. As I recall, I used for the mouse driver, something written by a user in the LACE, LACE users group in Great Britain. And I can't remember his name right now, but he wrote drivers for the mouse, joystick, paddles, touch tablet, And he wrote the drivers in such a way that it made it easy for the user to say, I want to use a driver for this device. And he'd load it in, and your software, which was written around his drivers, would work. And so his mouse driver was just excellent. And I give him credit, whoever he is from the LACE users group, for making that program possible, because his expertise with creating a beautiful mouse driver is what really made it possible for me to make M.T.O.S.
Cool. Do you still have an Atari, or do you play with them in emulators, or have you moved on?
Well, I cannot say that I've moved on. I cannot say that there isn't a single day that goes by that I do not think about the machines, some of the great software I used, which at the time, was pretty groundbreaking. You'd get a new utility or something, and it would just be great. Knock your socks off. Never knew it was possible, But I do have an XE set up in a corner of my basement, and I've got an emulator running right now because somebody contacted me that kind of piqued my interest again, so I had to walk down nostalgia lane, if you know what I mean.
Sure.
But the last thing that I attempted to write, and I kind of got away from it and never got back to it, was going back to that Quill, a text adventure game writer that we had previously discussed. I had done preliminary work on, looking at it and seeing what the differences were and what have you, but I never got around to completing it. Previous to that, I think the last things that I released were probably M-Basic, as in Micro Basic, and Mouse, things from that era. But I can tell you this.
Mm-hmm.
Being so heavily into assembly language, I'm amazed. I've forgotten much more than what I remember, but I still know this assembly language like I know the back of my hand. I can dream about it. That's something that was burned into me, I guess. I don't know.
That's funny. It's like riding a bike. You can't forget it, I guess.
Exactly. Now, if you'd like me to, I could take you up to modern times and just very quickly tell you, what I've most recently been into.
Yes, I was about to ask what you do today, if you want to give me a update about that.
Okay, my last position, to the uninitiated, because a lot of people don't know too much about computers, IT, or computer science. I just say, data analyst. But the technical title is a publishing coordinator, in which I just retired, so I'm having trouble with was and did. I want to talk like I'm still doing it. And anyways, I coordinated worldwide resources, China, India, Cleveland, Santa Maria, California, Portland, for processing data, and the accounts that I would handle were all the big automotive accounts, heavy equipment, power sports, you name it. And so I had gotten to the point where I could do data analysis, at least the initial, just by looking at data. I don't have to run any program to categorize the data. But of course, after the initial evaluation, you do have to get into analyses which will give you more of a report, as to what you can expect out of the data. Now, technically I'm retired, but I got a couple of jobs right now.
Nice.
I work a few hours every week on a neighbor's farm, and I help her out with her chores. She's got 25 sheep and 20 acres and beautiful green pasture, 5 sub-pastures, and of course a central paddock that all the fenced-in pastures connect to in the back of the barn, kind of a loafing area. And what else do I do? Oh, I actually help out in a meat processing plant.
Yikes.
Quite a change, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, this isn't for everyone, but I got so tired of driving 65 miles one way to my job, because like I said, I live out here in the country. And, I just became more and more of a country boy. I've got an orchard here, and gardens and things like that. And I'm much more into that now, and, that's just what I enjoy at this stage of my life.
Nice. Very good. So what haven't I asked about the Atari days that I should have?
Ooh, that's a big subject. I don't know. Having been exposed to the BBS wars or the SysOp wars, I realized different people have different sensibilities. I was always more duck and cover, and I felt that it drove people away. A lot of people, when others start arguing and fussing, they don't like it either, and they just shrink away. They want to experience a positive bulletin board experience. They want to see what other users are doing. It makes them happy to see a discussion where users are helping other users, either with software, simple things, or programming questions. And if they see people fussing and fighting, it would just drive them away. And that's something I think that the Atari BBSs and the Atari hardware platform had the potential to go a lot further than it did. But those who, at the time, were at the cutting edge, which was communicating through the BBSs, a lot of them were driven away by it. That's really regretful.
Yeah. If you could send a message to the Atari 8-bit computer community that still exists, and you can right now, what would you tell them?
I love you guys. I love the experience that we shared together, and some users are just now experiencing some of these things that we had experienced in the past, but it's still an experience that we share. It's just displaced by years or even decades. And it just makes me feel good that there's still people out there that are enjoying the experience. And heck, like I said, I've got something running right now, but the memories I have still gives me the experience. Somebody might argue it's not the same thing. Of course it's not the same thing. But when you've been down this road for as long as I have and have met so many great people and had such positive experiences, I'm telling you, it's memories to last a lifetime. The great sysops that I used to network with, I still keep in touch with one of them today, and I'm sure of the ones that are still alive, I could just call them up today with a cup of coffee, and we could just sit down and reminisce and just have a great time. But I'll tell you, the programmers and the sysops, there's not as many around as what there used to be, and that's real sad. I do listen. I come in occasionally to some of these, like Atari Age BBS, or Atari Age, yeah. And I hear about old friends and acquaintances who have passed on, and that really makes me sad.
Yeah. We're not getting any younger, that's for sure.
No, but I think if I understand what you're doing and you're chronicling and archiving and interviewing people, I think that's valuable because I compare what we went through in the early days to something like this. Imagine 1920s. Radio was new. Can you imagine coming right from horse and buggy and Model T, where telephones, a lot of places didn't have telephones. Number one, they hadn't strung the telephone lines, and number two, even if they had, people couldn't afford it. Anyways, radio comes along, and you could tune across the dial and get what seemed to be unlimited news and music and radio plays, radio theater. It was like magic. And I'll tell you something else. A lot of people built their own radios. By the way, I'm a little bit of a radio man myself. That's why I'm dwelling on it, because I identify with it. And so maybe you've come across ham radio operators.
Sure, I'm a ham.
They have clubs. So back then, and I'm sure still today in some areas, Atarians getting together, like with the old users groups and what have you, just like a bunch of ham radio operators getting together. When the Model T first came out, a lot of people couldn't afford a mechanic. Guess what they had to learn to do? Work on their own cars themselves. And so that's what we had to do. We had to work on our own computers ourselves. So in a peculiar kind of way, I kind of feel that, we were kind of like those early pioneers in these other areas that I just mentioned.
Nice. This is awesome. Thank you so much.
Kevin, it's been my pleasure.
If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute, there are two ways you can help. You can help fund these interviews directly by contributing to my Patreon. A small monthly contribution will help offset the expenses of making these oral history interviews. Contribute at patreon.com/Savitz. Or make a tax-deductible contribution to the Internet Archive, a nonprofit digital library that has done incredible things to preserve computer history. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate. Thanks.